So I'm in the airport, and we're going to finish up 19th century. And since we're in England, America, I have an English ale. I'm not certain what one it was anymore, but because it's 7:30 in the morning. So anyway, looking at England, because that's where we had left off there. So looking at your notes, it says, starting off here, it says John Philip Kemble Mount's productions of Shakespeare. Okay, one of the first things we need to understand here is that we're seeing an increase in spectacle for regular dramas in England around this time, and John Philip Kemble starts mounting these lavish productions of Shakespeare revivals, pretty much to the level that Garrick and de Lutherberg had done in the past. And he had a designer at the time named William Capon, who he was the principal designer for the Drury Lane until it burned in 1809, and then when he moved to Covent Garden, and it had recently been rebuilt because it burned in 1808, so it had been rebuilt. It just kind of like moved from theater to theater as it burned. But he became the fundamental driving force behind historical accuracy in English scenery, this William Capon. Now, because of all the wars of the Napoleonic era, just like everywhere else, England's resources have been severely depleted. London's population had grown to like 2 million by 1843, and it forces a lot of the theaters at this time to enlarge their seating capacity. Again, back to that it's a dismal time, so melodrama, which is this really lavish style of good versus evil and all this kind of stuff, melodrama becomes the staple from 1800s until around 1840s. Another reason it becomes popular is because it it appeals to the most unsophisticated theater goer. They can get the story, they can follow along with it. They don't have to be wildly learned in order to follow along what's going on. It's usually a good-hearted, good guy wins at the end feeling. So everybody sort of flocks to this, especially in these bad times. Around the 1840s, a sort of a gentlemanly melodrama appears, which appeals to the higher class of the audience. So they start bringing the higher class theater goer back in. The thing with why melodrama is really important is because it had all these exotic locales and all these incredible things that happened to the hero and the villain. This is the whole tie the woman down the railroad tracks and so on and so forth. Well, they did this kind of stuff on stage. It called for it. So it made these incredible scenic devices have to be done. And that's where scenery advances, is at this particular point in time when melodrama becomes king. So, moving on here, 1818. The Old Vic was built. Now, the Old Vic was originally called the Royal Coburg. It wasn't named it was renamed the Royal Victorian Theatre in 1833 in honor of the then Princess Victoria, who later became Queen, which is where we get the Victorian era from. It's called the Old Vic later, when it has a school attached to it, and there are students, and they're called Old Vic students. And that name stuck, so it becomes the Old Vic later on. Robert Elliston's King Lear in 1820. This is another one of those advances in realism as far as the ability to do amazing things on stage. His King Lear had trees that bent in the wind, storm sounds so loud you couldn't even hear Lear speak. He built a water system in there for more realistic fountains and waterfalls and rain. A guy named Clarkson Stanfield was the principal designer of this, and he creates this moving diorama to change the settings. Amazing stuff that grew out of a lot of what we were seeing from the vogue of melodrama. In 1820, the prompter's box appears. Now, you guys probably would never have come across one, but it was a little box at the very front of the stage, dead center, downstage as far as you can get. And that is where somebody actually sat inside it, underneath the stage floor, but because their head would poke out above stage floor, and they would prompt people for their lines. The reason is because this is the age of the star actor, okay? Actors did not rehearse for long periods, often a day or two, before they came in and did the show with people. So the prompter's box was necessary for them to feed lines to them. Okay, as star actors started coming into their own, touring, even into the United States, and demanding high salaries for what they did, became the norm instead of performing with a company. Most notable ones in England are John Philip Kemble and Edmund Kean. Now, Kemble was considered the leading actor of the English-speaking stage until his retirement. That passed on to Edmund Kean, who, of course, is the second actor, the star actor we're talking about. And they sort of set a precedent for at their time of what star actors could demand. So, back to the notes. 1823, James Robinson Planch persuades Charles Kemble to use historically accurate costumes for every role in the Shakespearean production. And it was, I think it was King John. That was the production that it was. And it was an incredible success. So, yay, historically accurate costuming works. But it still didn't catch on until William McReady really kicks it in and picks it up and uses it regularly in his productions around 1837. 1833, Parliament passes a copyright law. Okay, it's kind of a lame one. It only covers dramas written after 1823. The copyright is in the hands of the publisher, not the author. And it doesn't cover any dramatization of novels or anything along that line. So it also didn't extend actually anywhere beyond national boundaries. So it's kind of ineffective, but at least we're kind of getting to that route of starting to protect somebody who wrote something or who published something. 1837, we kind of already discussed this. William McReady uses historically accurate costumes, and that's when it really starts picking up as a popular thing that should be done everywhere. 1843, the Theatre Regulation Act is passed. Okay, so the Theatre Regulation Act actually took away a lot of the power of the Lord Chamberlain. He could only prohibit productions of plays that he felt would, if he felt it was fitting for the preservation of good manners and decorum of the public. That's the only reason he could do it. Otherwise, it was allowed to go on, and it gave additional powers to local authorities to license theaters, and it broke up the monopoly of the patent theaters. And it did become a bit of a problem, which is why by 1848, 5 years later, Queen Victoria revives the office of the Master of Revels to handle all of this and take care of it, and she appoints Charles Kean to it. By 1850 to 1900, popular forms of drama are pantomime, burlesque extravaganza, and musical entertainments. Just to let you know, it's still not the burlesque we're talking about. That won't happen until, of course, we hit America. Right? So, 1870s burlesque extravaganza begins to wane, and you see a decline in that form of entertainment. It starts to get replaced by comic opera, actually, especially that of two writers known as Gilbert and Sullivan. By 1860, we start to see new theaters being built in London. And by 1870, we have 9 new theaters built. So this is a time when theater is becoming extremely popular, and we start seeing a sort of plethora of theaters become built in the area. 1860 to 1880, this is a kind of an important group of people here, the Bancrofts, who managed the Prince of Wales Theatre. And they made a lot of innovations in theater management at the time. Touring with a full company with all your scenery and props, killing the curtain raiser and afterpiece. They stopped that kind of thing. Remember, they did that originally because some people didn't get to work in time, so they had to have a curtain raiser, then the main play, then an afterpiece, so that when you paid your money, you still felt like you got your money's worth. It became halfway through the main play. They stopped that. They said, nope, main play is the only thing. And they also started getting into establishing a matinee audience. So those of you actors who have to wake up on the Sunday morning, probably hungover, and have to go to do a matinee, you can blame the Bancrofts because they're the ones that really kind of started that concept. By 1886, the International Copyright Agreement is made, and that finally starts putting it outside of England's borders. It's still not perfect, but it's much better along the way of a good copyright law. So So it's looking at actor-managers. John Philip Kemble, we just talked about him, about these humongous Shakespearean productions. And the greatest English actor in the English-speaking world at this time. We have Charles Kemble. This is John Kemble's younger brother, actually. He was interesting in the fact that he used historically accurate costumes for every role in Shakespeare's King John. We discussed that. But it's that kickoff to starting, hey, historically accurate is the way to go. William Charles Macready. Now, definitely, without a question, one of my favorite guys, for several reasons. Number one, Macready was important in driving the manager, the director, the modern director. He drove that to pretty much be kind of what we look at it as today. He was one of those people that was important in that process. All right, some of the innovations made three major innovations, really, to be honest. He started doing blocking, which just means you tell them where to go on stage instead of just letting them wander aimlessly about, right? He championed actual acting during rehearsals instead of saving yourself for the performances. And he also insisted on historical accuracy in his costumes and settings. The first director to do this on a consistent basis, right? So these are the three things that he did that were really, really important. The fourth thing that he did that I just find fascinating is his acting in New York City at the Astor Place Theater in a Shakespearean play was the spark of the Astor Place riots. And we'll talk about those when we get into American theater. So, and I've read his memoirs, his personal account of it. It's fascinating. So, Macready, very interesting person. Madame Vestris, also important as far as a director is concerned, as far as creating the role of a director. She was kind of the first person to sort of coordinate all the elements of production into an integrated whole. So, costume, scenery, lighting, acting, and just sort of going, wait a minute, these all should somehow interconnect to tell the story. And she was one of the first people to do that. Also credited with the introduction of the box set into England. We're not certain if she was, but she was credited with that concept. And first person to use that with, at least first person to use it with some consistency. And she was also one of the first people that, when she used a box set, she enclosed the entire acting area within it instead of letting them spill out, and set them up like real rooms. So more realistic. Also, it's thought that she's the one that brought the box set over to America as well. Samuel Phelps, his work at the Sadler-Wells Theater began around 1844, and he continued Macready's work there. But he was really important in bringing poetic drama to sort of a higher level and reviving it for the mid-19th century. Charles Keene. He's the son of Edmund Keene, and he developed antiquarianism further than any English producer, which then perfects actual pictorial realism. Started bringing the factual audience back to the stage. What is antiquarianism? Antiquarianism is actual research into what these things should look like in these periods, costumes and settings, and actually practically like archaeological study and putting it back on stage with it. So he's also very important in helping establish the dominance of the director on the English stage. You have Henry Irving. He was a very successful actor and theater manager of his time, probably one of the most important actor-managers between 1880 and 1900. Also important because he had an actress in his company named Ellen Terry. Now, she was a leading actress and she was well known on her own, but one of the important things about Ellen Terry, unfortunately, and I hate to say it and it sort of sounds sexist, but is the fact that she gave birth to a man named Gordon Craig. Not a man, it was a child at the time, but nonetheless. Gave birth to Gordon Craig, who became one of the foremost designers of modern theater. Right, the only playwright you've got in here is Dion Boucicault. Dion Boucicault is really interesting because he was like the most successful dramatist of the latter 19th century. And he began his career around 1841, most famous for a play called The Corsican Brothers. I don't know if you've heard it or not. They're usually, his plays are usually suspenseful, melodramatic, lots of sensational spectacle, always tend to use the most up-to-date, latest scientific inventions somewhere in his plays, which is what made them pretty interesting to people. And actually, at least one of his shows, the Corsican Brothers, had a specific special effect made for it. It's called the Corsican Trap. And what it was in this one scene, a guy is sitting over here at a desk, and the ghost of his brother has to come up, rise up out of the floor, and move over to him and talk to him. Right? And there's, I think I put a video of this on here for you of an actual one in use, where the actor slowly comes up out of the floor and moves to the side all at the same time, so that by the time he reaches his brother's side, he is now fully at his full height and it just has grown out of the floor as he's moved, as he's floated along. Very cool, very innovative at their time, but that's one of the reasons that Lucico was such an incredible playwright, because he pushed the limits of what the stage could do. All right, so that is England. Let's look at United States. All right. Theater resumes in the United States after the Revolutionary War, and Philadelphia was the dominant theatrical center. Now, at the time, you still have the Hallam's in Jamaica, run by Douglas and his wife, the former Mrs. Hallam, right? They returned back in 1784. Now, if you see on your thing here, it says after 1790, major troops abandoned the share arrangement, and most minor troops keep it until the late 19th century. Very true. One of the reasons is because Thomas Wignall becomes David Douglas's partner in the Hallam troupe, which is the American company. Since it's a partnership now, it can no longer be a share company. These two guys have to control it and then pay the actors a salary, right? So now what happens is the actors are no longer in control, and they become labor on demand. This is the birth of that here in this country, where we don't have a controlling stake in the theater company. We're just a paycheck, right? And which is true today. So that sort of birthed that, major troops do this now. Actors on, labor on demand, and they don't manage it anymore. It's run by corporate. Not quite corporate yet. It'll come. That'll come real soon. And yeah, I'm sick. 1791, Wignall leaves, drops out of the partnership, and he erects the Chestnut Street Theater with Alexander Einagel, designed by Inigo Richards, and it is going to be the finest theater in North America. It's also going to be an important one later on. Acting troops are still the norm in North America. Managers usually went to England to recruit people. It's actually actors in England who could not get work became some of our finest actors over here. So there you go. 1793, the Federal Street Theater is erected in Boston. The Puritan ban on theater in Philadelphia is lifted with the opening of this theater, right? I know, well, that's Philadelphia and this is Boston. I understand that. But once this theater opens, the ban in Philadelphia is lifted. Originally, a British company was brought in, and they didn't do very well. From 1806 to 1811, it was sort of a much better professional theater company was brought in, and it started to thrive at that point. Thomas Cooper and Stephen Rice, I think I heard. Oh, nope. Park Theater built in New York is the next one. Yeah. Thomas Cooper, Stephen Price built the Park Theater in New York, and it was built in 1798. And it becomes New York's leading theater until about the 1840s, and did probably the most to popularize the tour of starring actors. 1808 carbon arc light is invented by Sir Humphrey Davy in London. Okay. It wasn't really widely used until around 1840. But really what it is basically is it's two sticks of carbon. And you have a electrical line connected to them. And you shoot electricity through it, and the electricity jumps from one node to the other, creating an arc of light. That, by the by, if you touch, will make you go unconscious for about 2 hours. Just saying. 1812. Louisiana Purchase opens up west up to expansion. Okay. So, funny story. Napoleon and his brother were fighting about giving us this land. They needed money for the wars, and they were fighting about giving up this kind of land. And they were arguing about it, and Napoleon was in the bathtub. And he stands up to yell at his brother and make his point of why they should sell the land. And he slips, falls down in the bathtub, and they both crack up laughing and forget about the argument. And then 2 days later, Napoleon just signs the paper on his desk without any problem, and we get the Louisiana Purchase. So that opens up the entire West to us. And then, of course, it'll open it up for theater. Mississippi River becomes a touring route for theater. Theaters on the West start being situated next to rivers because you can actually get to them and so on and so forth. So that's a major event in theater history, actually. Also in 1812, just shortly after 1812, the War of 1812, John Jacob Astor, he made his money in fur, like fur hats and like beaver pelts and stuff like that. Yeah, John Jacob Astor bought 40% of Manhattan. If you're familiar with Manhattan nowadays, thinking about owning 40% of that. And the Park Theater was part of that purchase. He walks into manager William Dunlap, and he said, "You need to make $100 a week for me, or I'm going to tear the building down and put something else up here." This is the time when I was talking about earlier, where it comes out, the control of the theaters comes out of the hands of the manager and into corporate. This is that time. John Jacob Astor, big businessman, says, "You're going to make this much money or I'm destroying this place." Now it's corporate. All right. 1815. Samuel Drake runs a tour down the Ohio River. Okay. Now, just like I said earlier, theaters are built by rivers. Samuel Drake sort of moves about down the Ohio River and starts touring and hitting places specifically on the river. But shortly thereafter, the Mississippi becomes the main river to do. The problem is that, well, we'll get to this a little bit later. You get on the river, you got to stop and you walk all the way, basically sort of caravan all the way back and then do it all over again. So it's very difficult. We'll see how that's going to change in the very near future here. Between 1815 to 1850, spectacle becomes increasingly important. Okay, some companies are still using stock scenery, but occasionally a few pieces are starting to be given a little more historical accuracy. So they're really starting in America to see the advantage of having really spectacular pieces involved in their shows, because people will come and see it. 1816. Remember I said Chestnut Street Theater is going to be important. It is here. The Chestnut Street Theater is the first theater in the world to light the stage with gas. Now, okay, remember we talked about the other theaters in Europe had lit the audience with gas. This is the first one to light the stage with gas. Again, we're looking at gas that's barely understood and certainly less controlled. So these are why we tend to have burnings and explosions. Also, at that same time, roughly that same time, 1816, the limelight is invented. Okay, it's also called the calcium or the Drummond light. And it uses a spotlight and it's widely adopted by the 1850s. Let me tell you how that works exactly. So you've got a block of lime right here, and you have a small torch near it that is powered by a hydrogen-oxygen mix, which, by the by, mixed correctly is rocket fuel. So you shoot this at the block of lime, burning it. And when lime burns, it gives off this incredibly bright light, kind of a greenish tinge to it. And that becomes a spotlight. When you focus it now, it becomes a spotlight. And that is where we get the term "in the limelight" from, because that is where that came from. All right, 1816, we did that one, I'm sorry. 1828, the birth of the minstrel show, Thomas D. Rice. Okay, I know you guys are probably not familiar with a minstrel show, but a minstrel show depicts usually a sort of a slave or very low-born sort of a black person who is Southern and does song and dance, has all that kind of the mannerisms of 1800s Southern black man. Thomas D. Rice introduced his Jim Crow song and dance. So Jim Crow was the character. The weird thing is that Thomas D. Rice was a white actor who did blackface. The weird thing is that for the longest time, almost everybody that I ever knew, theater historians, assumed that Thomas D. Rice was a black man. Who actually, first black actor. Wrong. And the reason is because most of the history books denote him as a black actor. A lot of them do. And because, and I'll try not to deal with this word specifically, but a lot of the texts from the era call him the N-word actor. So we immediately assumed he was a black actor. It wasn't until I came across an English source, because he toured England even. He was that good and that well and that famous, where they called him a derogatory name for an American. I want to say Johnny Cracker. I think it was something to that effect. I can't remember exactly. And then they said, "Who does blackface?" And it was at that point in time I went, "Oh my God, he was white." So, yeah, this is a strange situation where, for the longest time, most people considered him a black actor, and he really wasn't. Thomas Rice was a white man doing blackface early on. So it becomes really popular, vaudeville style, but it begins to wane around 1870s. It's amazing between around 1850 to 1870. By 1870, it starts to wane. By 1990, it's just sort of a curiosity. 1919, not 1990. Early 20s, you still hear occasionally. You could probably go online and find some records of certain people doing like Al Jolson and whatever. But this stuff is outlawed today. You really can't even do it legally without getting horrendously sued. So that's the birth of the minstrel show. If you want to look up what minstrel show specifically is, so you see it, then it is. But it's that blackface type of thing. 1831, William Chapman outfits a flatboat to be used as a theater. This is kind of the first showboat. The problem with a flatboat is that it floats on the river, which means you're not going to go back up. You get done going down the river, playing to all the venues along the river, stop. You've got a caravan back up. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Get another flatboat, do it again. Okay? So it's not terribly conducive, but at least it's something. By 1836, steamboats, which were invented in 1807, are widely used. So now the steamboat can go against the current. Now you can go down the river and back up the river. Now showboating is really popular. 1838, box set is introduced into America and very possibly by Madame Vestris, like we said earlier. By 1840s, American writers and actors are really no longer novelties. They're actually becoming rather more common. At that time, also, the gas table was invented, which made it possible to control all the lights from sort of one centralized board. That means you could do your gas lighting on stage, gas lighting in the house, whatever, and control it all from one board. Still really scary. People have no idea what they're dealing with. 1840, by the 1840s, the carbon arc light is widely used. Okay. Now, by the 1840s, we're getting to a point in American theater where spectacular scenic devices is becoming more common. And that means trapdoors, treadmills, lighting advancements, and things like that, pushing us ever closer to what we know as the modern stage. I mean, they did a production of Ben-Hur where they had a chariot race with real live horses on stage. And they did it by having treadmills that went like the horses ran on, like I guess we do for exercise now, right? They had treadmills that horses ran on with the chariots, so they're staying central, but the treadmill's going, so the horses are full gallop. Then they got a panorama scene behind them, like moving one way, and then set pieces in front of them that are on rotating belts that move like this, in the same direction, so that it looks like they're passing things. It's amazing. We don't waste time doing that much today. So, in 1845 to 1846, Charles Keene's Richard III and King John at Park Theater. This is when archaeological accuracy took hold here in America, is these productions. We looked at it and went, oh my God, that looks like I was back in that era. So now we went, that's what we need to do. Historical research to make it archaeologically accurate when we do historical plays. $1849, I told you we'd get there. I told you we'd get there, and this is one of my favorite things in theater history, the Astor Place riots. Okay. Two actors. William McReady, Edwin Forrest. Edwin Forrest is the American. William McReady is the Brit. They're playing Shakespeare pretty much across the street from each other in New York. And William McReady's people are the sort of well-to-do, that remember the motherland, so on and so forth, right? They're the upper crust. Edwin Forrest's people, they're the blue collars. No kidding. Some of his supporters, a major group of his supporters, were the gangs of New York. Not kidding. They were really behind Edwin Forrest and majorly involved in the Astor Place riots. So, what happens is McReady starts playing his role at the Astor Place. And I don't recall which Shakespearean production it was. I want to say it was Macbeth. A lot of the tickets were bought by gangs in New York and by the supporters of Forrest. And they flooded the theater, and they just kept catcalling and whatever. And there was even a sign put out there, and I don't remember the exact terminology, but friends of peace will remain silent, or something to that effect. It's like basically saying, just shut up. They threw things at him: bottles, coins, chairs. Half a dead sheep's carcass was thrown on stage. I don't know what they did with the other half, but regardless, this kind of stuff continued. And this wasn't the first time. I mean, in his tour of America in New York theaters, this was happening throughout on occasion. And so the sheep's carcass one might have even been at a different theater venue, but at this particular one, people outside were throwing rocks and bricks and everything through windows. They were trying to actually dismantle, tear apart the theater building itself. This was the first time when American militaries, the Guard, the National Guard, was called in to deal with a riot. Very first time in history. And they killed 25 people and wounded over 200. They just started shooting aimlessly into the crowds. And the argument was over who was the better actor, McCready or Forrest. 25 people dead, 200 some injured. Mass hysteria over who was the better Shakespearean actor. Crazy. That's why I love that moment in history. All right, 1856. I jumped one, didn't I? 1849, the gold rush. Okay, so everyone knows about the minor 49ers, right? The 1849 gold rush, California gold rush. Why it's important in theater history is because a whole bunch of towns popped up in California due to the gold rush. And when they did that, they needed things like entertainment, right? Saloons, so on and so forth. Things to keep the miners happy. So theaters started popping up, and they were some of the best in America. Why? Because they had an ass ton of gold backing them up. So they could afford to build the best theaters there are. So a lot of those theaters become some of the best in the nation, and even star actors start touring out there. But also, beginning around 1850, you start seeing this vogue of the long run. We've talked about it before in Europe, in American theater, and repertories of theaters diminished. Why? Because if you're doing a long run, if your show is going to run 300 plus performances, you don't need that many performances to fill out your season. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written in, I think, 1852. It performed 300 times between 52 and 53. 300 times in 1 year. That's an extended run. Most popular play of the period, and it's a very important play as far as theater history is concerned. And still, burlesque extravaganza is one of our most popular styles at this time as well. So, looking at 1856, copyright law is passed. It doesn't really work terribly well since it really provided for registration of works in the local courts. That means I write a play, I've got to go to my local court and do it. But someone 200 miles away that might have seen it could do it down there, and my local court isn't really going to do anything about that. So, again, nice to have a copyright law, still doesn't have any teeth. 1860 carbon arc light is turned into a spotlight. Basically, they took that carbon arc light I told you about and they housed it into a into something that would focus the beam and send it on the stage. That was the one that I worked on, which is why I know if you touch the arc, you'll go unconscious for 2 hours. So anyway, 1870, I have registration of works transferred to the Library of Congress. Okay, well, we're missing some things here, which amazes me that I did not put into this this timeline here. So I'll at least say this much for 1870, on the next thing on your line. The transfer of registration from the local courts to the Library of Congress corrects the problems in that copyright law. Now it's federal. And you know, somebody steals it down in Georgia and I wrote it in Michigan, it's still a copyright infringement. That fixes it. But let's back up just a little bit. Some things that I can't believe that are not on your list here. Number one, this is so amazing because it's the birth of the modern musical theater. 1866, a troupe of ballet dancers, French, were stranded in New York. And there was a production of The Black Crook that was not doing terribly well. It was a melodrama. It wasn't doing terribly well. And the producer saw that these ballet dancers were, French ballet dancers were stranded and said, throw them in our show. Just put them in our show and make it exciting. And it made it amazingly popular. So at that point, burlesque began to change from its sort of a collection of variety of acts mingled in with musical numbers to beautiful women who are scantily clad, and it reached a height of its popularity. That's where burlesque, as we know it, began. But that's also where musical theater began, with singing, dancing, right? This is the birth of musical theater. 1866, The Black Crook. It reached the height of its popularity before World War I, this sort of burlesque type thing, which, by the way, the burlesque striptease grew out of that around 1929, 1930. And modern vaudeville actually grew out of the same movement, so that birthed a lot of things, and I can't believe I didn't put that on your list anywhere. A lot of this stuff was reshaped in around the 1880s by a guy named Tony Pastor, who wanted to make it more suitable for family audiences. So, 1879, Thomas Edison invents the incandescent lamp. Well, that's exciting and nice, but what does it do for us? Well, it gives us a whole new lighting style that isn't gas, oil, or candles, all of which are open flame, ready to burn our theater up. So finally we have something that's a little more controllable. The watches are real low, so the limelight was still used to supplement a lot. 1891, the United States adopts the International Copyright Agreement that England had put forth, finally. Okay. So now we see managers. Edwin Booth. Edwin Booth was the brother of John Wilkes Booth. If you don't know who John Wilkes Booth is, you've been under a rock for most of your life. Yes, his brother killed President Lincoln. Now, Edwin Booth was one of the top actors in America, one of the best actors America had ever known. And his brother kills the president. Kind of a downer on your acting name. They were an acting family. His father was an actor. His brother was an actor, was just not as good. And Edwin was one of the top. So he retires from acting for a little while after that happened, not surprising. Comes back, builds a brand new theater to try to sort of fix the family name, as it were. 1869 is when he builds this theater. The innovations he put in this theater were amazing. Level stage, no more rake. Level stage, no grooves for the wing and drop system. He has a 76-foot fly space. Now he's flying scenery in. That's a first step. And also he's got huge trapdoors with hydraulic lifts so he can push scenery up from the 50-foot work area beneath the stage. So now if a rock has to be here, they can press a button and the trapdoor will open and the rock will come up out of the floor. Sounds exceedingly cool and very exciting. However, to be honest, the Romans did it with the Colosseum a long time ago. It just wasn't hydraulic. It was levers and pulleys. This kind of concept is called the free plantation of scenery. Edwin Booth started it. Next we have Augustine Daly. He contributed a lot to realism by using strikingly realistic effects. Introduced new subject matter too. Actually, this guy, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but he was the first person to portray Native Americans as villains rather than a noble savage. So this is where you get the cowboy Indian thing from, is Augustine Daly's concept of portraying them as villains. Also, however, very instrumental in establishing the director as a major force in American theater. Steele Mackay, this guy was brilliant. Playwright as well as a producer and a director. He also introduced the Delsart acting method to America. We talked about the Delsart acting method when we talked about Europe. He began actor training programs. It was called, it was an actor training program at the Lyceum Theater, and it was later to become the American Academy of Dramatic Art, created by Steele Mackay. He was a successful playwright. He had a play called Hazel Kirk, which ran for 486 performances in New York. Then I think 14 companies took it on the road. He did a lot to advance realism. This guy was amazing. He built a theater at Madison Square Garden. It had 2 elevator stages. This was in 1879 now, mind you. 2 elevator stages. So basically what happens is this. You can have Act 1 down here, Act 2 built up here. Alright, you finish Act 1, you press a button, and it does this. And there's Act 2. You fix Act 1 down here to Act 3, you press a button, boom, here's Act 3. Amazing. This guy did this in 1879. He also created a show for Buffalo Bill Cody that involved a realistic cyclone and a stampede. He was intending at one of the World's Fairs to, in a theater, do a production of Columbus's Voyage to America, flood the entire stage area, and have the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria on tracks and moving about on stage. That's his visions. This guy was unbelievable as far as spectacular realism. That one never actually happened, though, but it was a plan that he had. All right, so let's look at playwrights. There's not too many of them at this particular point in time. We've got John Howard Payne. He was a native-born dramatist, but then he went to England for 20 years, and then he becomes America's first successful international dramatist. Luckily, we're at the end. Bronson Howard, he was the first professional dramatist in America, which means he was the first person to make his entire living off the plays he wrote. He's the first American dramatist to receive regular royalty payments. Also in 1891, he was the founder of the Society of American Dramatists and Composers, and that is the forerunner of the Dramatists Guild today. And that is the end of 19th century theater. We'll see you again when I am in Louisiana for 20th century, for modern theater.